Good morning. It's been an unsettling week for those people who think Britain should still project real power in the world. First of all, our MPs criticise our strikingly modest contribution to combating ISIS, just 7% of the airstrikes, and a total of, wait for this, 3 military personnel in Iraq outside the Kurdish areas. I mean, I'm sure these are impressive people, but just 3 of them? And then Britain's former top commander in NATO, General Sir Richard Sheriff, says the Cameron government is in danger of becoming a foreign policy irrelevance on the Ukrainian crisis. It's all about money and taxes, of course, and I can't help thinking of Philip Larkin's famous poem, Homage to a Government, from 1969. It ends like this. Next year, we shall be living in a country that brought its soldiers home for lack of money. The statues will be standing in the same tree-muffled squares and look nearly the same. Our children will not know it's a different country. All we can hope to leave them now is money. A bit optimistic, that last line, but it does seem highly relevant to 2015, don't you think? And joining me today for our review of the Sunday newspapers, the Liberal Democrat, peer Baroness Ollie Grender, and the journalist Catherine Mayer, whose new biography of Prince Charles reveals that his household is nicknamed Wolf Hall, and in Tudor times would certainly have got her slung in the tower. I've no idea whether this will be an election in which foreign policy looms large. I rather doubt it, but the threat of terrorism certainly does. And among my guests today in his first television interview is Britain's new national spokesman on counter-terrorism, Mark Rowley, Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Does he have the resources he needs? And if he doesn't, the man to blame is my next guest, the Chancellor, George Osborne, who joins us just as the election frenzy over business, taxes and the economy reaches boiling point. I'll also be talking to Tristram Hunt, Labour's education spokesman, announcing ambitious plans for childcare today, but he's been involved in a bit of nun-bashing this week. If the Scots kick out Trident, will the Welsh welcome the submarines? Leanne Wood, leader of Plaid Cymru, is with me as well. So a very busy programme. Let's get straight on with the news from Nagamun Chetty.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Prince Charles has expressed alarm at the number of young British Muslims being radicalised by terrorist groups. He said that it was frightening that it was happening through the internet. The Prince made the comments in a BBC interview recorded before he began a 6-day visit to the Middle East. Our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, reports from the Jordanian capital, Amman.
He is respected among the royal families which rule in countries like Jordan and in the Gulf. And this visit by Prince Charles to Jordan, a few days after the murder by Islamic State of one of the country's Air Force pilots, will be appreciated. His first meeting in Amman was with a group of Christians who were driven from their homes in Syria and northern Iraq by fighters from Islamic State. And it is the process which radicalises young Muslims and sends them to fight for Islamic State which is troubling the Prince. In an interview for BBC Radio 2's The Sunday Hour, Charles says the extent of the radicalisation is alarming.
Well, of course, this is one of the greatest worries, I think, and the extent to which this has happened is the alarming part. I mean, particularly in a country where, like ours, where, you know, the values we hold dear, you would think that people who've come here and born here, go to school here, would imbibe the sort of those values.
Later today, Charles will meet Jordan's King Abdullah. Charles will express Britain's sympathy and solidarity with Jordan in the fight against Islamic State. Jordan, of course, wants something more tangible, more financial help to cope with the refugees, more extensive training for its military. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, in Amman.
Hundreds of unnecessary deaths may have been prevented because of emergency intervention at 11 hospital trusts. That's the conclusion of a report by the healthcare analysis group, Dr. Foster. The research found that death rates had fallen by nearly 10% compared with an average for all trusts in England of 3%. Separately, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has ordered an annual review of deaths caused by negligent staff in English hospitals. The new yearly checks will allow hospitals to be ranked according to the number of deaths caused by poor care. Crucial negotiations over the future of eastern Ukraine will resume today with a telephone conference between the leaders of Germany and France and the presidents of Russia and Ukraine. Being discussed is a new ceasefire plan thought to include a demilitarised zone requiring Russian-backed forces to retreat. Yesterday, Ukraine's president appealed for support in his country's fight against the rebels. The presidential election in Nigeria has been postponed by 6 weeks because of concerns about security. It was due to take place on Saturday, but not enough troops are available because they're fighting Boko Haram militants in the northeast of the country. The election will now be held on the 28th of March. That's all from me for now. I'll be back with the headlines just before 10 o'clock. Now it's time to get back to Andrew.
Many thanks, Naga. And now, as ever, to the front pages of the newspapers. You heard just now about the NHS unnecessary deaths in England, and this is the story the Sunday Telegraph launches. It says 1,000 patients a month are dying needlessly. A very powerful story there on the front page of the Telegraph. And we're also talking, of course, about Prince Charles. Charles to UK Muslims, abide by our values, it says. And he also claims that he is going to raise the question of the blogger who's being lashed week by week in Saudi Arabia. And he gets there as well. The Observer, Tony Blair on the front page of the Observer. Blair's pledge. Some good news for Ed Miliband. I will do what it takes to help Miliband win. Now, what might that mean? We'll talk about that in a moment. And finally, let's go to the Sunday Times. Top Tory ensnared in tax probe. This is a senior legal minister, and it's a highly complicated story. We probably won't go into in detail, but quite interesting. Also, number 10 plots early Europe vote in 2016. If you've been watching this programme alertly over the last few weeks, you'd know that already. Anyway, to the paper review, and as promised, Catherine, I think we're going to start with the Prince Charles story, since you wrote a big book about him. You're the person to have here this morning on the sofa, and there's a big spread there in the Mail on Sunday you've chosen.
Yes, I mean, this is very interesting because the idea that the Prince might be asking the Saudis to change their policy towards the blogger Raif Badawi, who has, as you said, been being flogged, is quite plausible, but it is less plausible that it would have been briefed in advance. What the thing about Prince Charles is he does have this extraordinary relationship in the Gulf. It started actually in 1993. It's partly just because he's a prince and they open up to other royals. They like royals. But he gave a speech on Islam in 1993 in which he talked about Islam not having a monopoly on extremism, and he talked about the Christian Crusades, he talked about the bad things other religions had done, and he talked about the good things in Islam.
And so he accumulated credit out there.
He has been accumulating credit ever since.
And ending these floggings is the kind of thing that he can use his credit on.
Yes.
As long as we don't talk about it too much, which we're now doing, of course.
Indeed. He has been mistaken as being a kind of arms salesman on steroids in that part of the region. I'm not at all ruling out that that has been part of the palette of activities, not selling them, but, you know, the soft diplomacy, soft power. But what he is also doing is he's getting to see people that other people will not be able to see and talk to them on a level they can't. So he's being accompanied on this big trip around the Middle East by Justine Greening. She's going to end up in side rooms with functionaries. He'll be having the high-level discussions. And in the Gulf, unlike many other parts of the world, his interests and the government's interests are rather perfectly aligned.
Now, listening to you here, you sound very sympathetic to Prince Charles, but when your book came out, you were absolutely monstered and jumped all over, not least by Clarence House itself. What was that experience like?
It's been quite an intense week, I have to say.
Intense in a bad way?
Mostly surreal, yes, fairly unpleasant sometimes. But I have to say, I mean, with Clarence House, I think maybe the monstering also didn't come as directly from them as it appeared to. I've been having quite cordial conversations with them during this week. Was
it a mistake, do you think, for his private secretary to write to the newspapers and say he won't interfere, he won't be a meddling monarch? I think that there was nothing in William Nye's letter to the Times that I disagreed with. There had indeed been informed speculation, it just didn't come from me. The problem with these sorts of stories, and in fact it's something I cover in the book, is that
the Prince has found it very difficult to get his views across over the years. Some of that comes from him. He makes mistakes, and one of the mistakes might have been to react too soon to the book without actually knowing what was in it. But also there is just this, as you well know, there is this
jangling
huge
kind of paranoia. Okay, let's move on to the next
Speaking
big
of
story.
People
Jangling.
who get regularly monstered. There's a double-page spread here about Ed Miliband and by Toby Helm in the Observer, saying, you know, kind of they're still,
They're still just ahead.
still just
despite
ahead in
all
the
of
polls
this stuff. Yeah.
by 2%. But when you read into the detail, there are some extraordinary things in here, like they're still rowing about who's writing their manifesto. There's still some critical issues that they haven't made decisions on. For instance, you know, the tuition fees. But what it does give an overall impression of is that extraordinary, given the week that they've had. But we always, in the Westminster bubble, have to remember that if Ed Balls forgets a name on Newsnight, most people tend not to be watching.
Yeah. Now, I should have said earlier on that you are actually part of the Liberal Democrat election team.
I am.
And in the context of that, it seems to a lot of us that the next thing that we're interested in is whether the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats start to get close together, get into bed together, start to talk and so forth. Because the SNP's demands for some kind of arrangement with the Labour Party seem quite stiff. And it's perfectly possible that after the election you'll be in a position of being able to go to one side or go to the other side. And it seemed to a lot of people that Nick Clegg's speech this week was a little bit more friendly towards the Labour side than the Tory one.
Well, I suspect between now and polling day that every time Nick so much as sneezes, there'll be an interpretation of whether it was a sneeze to the right or the left.
Yeah.
I think it's a much wider question for the other parties. For instance, you know, we all know, and there's historical record about how Labour approached the talks in 2010 in a way where they were so unprepared. I think it's similar to this indecision that they have at quite a wide level. They treat us a little bit like a kind of naughty teenager that stayed out all night, that should come back and apologise.
Stayed out all night with George Osborne and Cameron, even
possibly.
worse.
But actually, we've bought our own flat. We've got a car. We're dating. You know, when they need to treat us like the adults that we are. We also have our own philosophy, which has lasted far longer than theirs.
And you think they're still, in a sense, too tribal to reach out to you properly?
Well, I think a lot of questions should be asked of them if they're capable of working in partnership with anyone. But let me simply stress that at the end of the day, it will be predominantly down to the maths, and it will be down to people. You can't vote in favour or against a coalition. All you can do is vote for the parties that you want to have the most number of MPs.
Sure.
That's the only thing you can do.
Which leads us again to the front page of the Observer, Catherine Mayor. Tony Blair, I will do what it takes to help Miliband win. Do we know what that might be?
We don't really, and the thing is, I'm not sure that he does either. Just before we entirely move off the piece Ollie was highlighting, can I just say that clearly Labour is also has its own Wolf Hall going on, according to that. But I mean, the thing that is so interesting about this, Blair, clearly he's the most successful Prime Minister leader Labour's had. And they have this really odd problem with him, that his legacy is so...
Still in the ante-room with the kind of key half-locked, isn't he?
And his legacy is so difficult because they can't ignore him, nor should they ignore him, because of so much was done during those Blair administrations. And yet, you know, he can't lock himself away.
So if Ollie is the naughty teenager, Tony Blair is the slightly embarrassing uncle living next door.
He's something more than slightly embarrassing. He is both a great asset for them and probably a great liability, and they don't know how to deal with it, and neither does he.
Now,
Speaking
the
of which,
Chilcot report, a very, very interesting double-page spread again in the Mail on Sunday.
By Simon Walters in the Mail on Sunday, and saying that the Chilcot report, we now have the number of words, so we're making progress, it's 1 million. And that it will be absolutely devastating for about 30 people who have been sent letters by the chairman, Sir John Chilcot. Still very little regarding the timing. The timing is going to clearly be, you know, kind of every push is to make it after the election, but that it will be absolutely devastating for those who have those 30 people.
So it's no suggestion of a whitewash, far from it. The reverse is what we think now.
Absolutely, and
very interesting.
and so, you know, a very interesting piece there.
So
and of course it takes us back to Blair Tony Blair whether he's a help or a hindrance in terms of the election.
And that's one war. There's another war looming, according to the international pages of the Daily Telegraph. This is the Ukrainian peace talks, Catherine, in crisis.
And in fact, François Hollande has been saying that, you know, if this is a last-ditch attempt and the alternative is war, for many of us we would say there has already been a war going on there for some time.
Yeah.
There has been a big high-level meeting in Munich where there's an annual security conference, and what comes out in this piece and has come out of Munich is, of course, that there are splits among the people who are seeking to contain the crisis, really about whether to arm Ukraine or not.
By and large, am I right to say the Germans and the French are more cautious about arming Ukraine? The Americans would like to see...
America is fence-sitting. But
surprise, yeah.
Yes.
As ever at the moment.
Germany, Merkel is playing an incredibly interesting role in this. Germany is coming out of its shell in many ways, and she is coming out of her shell more than you've ever seen, taking more of an action. But Germany is always going to be a power that is cautious about military action. And
Sure. Ollie, now you've picked up, speaking of Ukraine.
Yes.
I have never heard generals use language quite as strong as this. They're talking about the coalition not being powerful enough. We can only wave a tiny little stick there. Is that right? Is that the quote?
Well, yes, it is. I think that's weird because I think I hear generals being outspoken all the time, especially when it comes to defence budgets. And let's just gloss over the whole history of procurement in our country and how much money has been wasted. But yeah,
both Richard Sheriff and General Dannett are very, very cross in this piece, aren't
yes, and Dannett has a kind of record of being cross, but Sheriff, that's news, or that's new information. What I find quite surprising is he thinks that, and I'm not a huge fan of the Prime Minister in terms of international, and guess what, surprise, surprise, in terms of Europe. But actually, I just think if you are going to send someone along to negotiate on behalf of NATO, that it has to be Merkel. And, you know, kind of Hollande, well, yes, but you wouldn't send the entire NATO committee
we sent the right person.
Negotiate. And I think it's to be fair to David Cameron on this occasion, I think it's the right thing to do.
She's the neighbour, she's got the fluent Russian, she knows Putin well, so she's the right person. Okay.
There's also an understanding in European capitals that a lot of people's foreign policy from many different countries is driven by their domestic weakness. And, you know, you see that playing out.
We're almost running out of time, guys, so I think you have a story about femicide.
Yes,
from The Observer.
Indeed. This is a very interesting... This is just something I wanted to hail as a very good project. A woman called Karen Igala Smith has been, since 2012, documenting women who were killed by men and actually telling something of their stories. And this is now turning into a database that will stop this just being statistics and begin to perhaps lend some understanding.
It's kind of roll of honour online.
Yes.
Yeah. Final story, Ollie, from you. Another, from your point of view, good news story of certainly
Fabulous
Parliament behaving boldly.
Here. Yeah, and I think you know it's about mitochondrial donations, and what a fabulous moment in our Parliament that we have a free vote this week, and in the House of Commons, our MPs.
This is the three-parent baby.
Three-parent donation, and as someone who did IVF myself and pre-genetic diagnosis, I'm all for this. And I think it's just a fantastic story this week about our House of Commons taking a free vote and us now being global leaders in this area.
Not everything the House of Commons does is stupid or ignoble. On that note, thank you both very much indeed. And into the weather, biting winds, snow and ice. It feels like we've had a bit more than a cold snap. How much longer is this going to go on? Let's find out from Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt, please say not very long.
Oh, good morning, Andrew. Well, for one, no snow, no biting wind this week, so that is some good news if you've not been enjoying it. And it's all because high pressure is setting up roosts across the UK and will be here throughout much of the week. What that means is a largely dry week in store for many of you. Now, cloud amounts are going to vary from day to day, so who gets the sunshine, who gets the patchy fog that result from light winds will differ from one day to the next. Today, it's across western areas of England, eastern Wales, southwest Scotland. That fog could linger all day long, temperatures struggling to get much above freezing. Lots of fog on the hills in the northwest of Scotland with some splashes of rain for the Highlands and Islands. Most of you, though, a lovely dry Sunday. Good deal of sunshine around, and in the sunshine, could see highs around 8 or 9 degrees. Through tonight, though, the fog will be back, particularly across England and Wales. Winds lightest here, Midlands, northwest England and through Wales most prone. Still foggy in the damp Highlands and Islands, but for most a dry night. On the face of it, it looks like we'll avoid a frost. But to be honest, the cloud will break every now and again, and I think some of you will still have some frost on the car first thing. But not the bitter starts we've had on recent Monday mornings. Still the fog, though, to hamper the morning commute across some parts of England and Wales, particularly in the west. Still some drizzle and some blustery winds in the far north of Scotland, but for most, a dry and bright day, even if there's a bit more cloud than today. Back to you, Andrew.
So bad. Many thanks. Now, we've been hearing a lot about the rise and rise of the SNP and promises of further Home Rule for Scotland. We've heard about English votes for English laws. But what about Wales? Is it getting left behind in the constitutional carve-up? I'm joined now by the leader of Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party, Leanne Wood. Good morning to you, Leanne. You're still working on your Welsh, I gather. How's it going?
It's going well, thank you.
Excellent.
Yes.
Now, the SNP have been roaring ahead, as we've said, in Scotland. The same has not been happening to Plaid in Wales. Why do you think that is?
There are a number of reasons for that. I think the fact that they've had a referendum recently has put the politics of Scotland at the heart of the agenda. But there's an opportunity for people in Wales to do that in May's election, I think. There's every chance that there could be a hung parliament in May and Plaid Cymru could hold the balance of power. So this question of home rule and parity of Scotland in terms of powers and finance for Wales has a chance to be put on the agenda now.
So if the chips fall for you that way and you have your little lever there, how would you use it? What would you really want out of a hung parliament for Wales?
Well, there are two clear areas. It's parity with Scotland in terms of finance and powers, and also an end to...
a full Welsh Parliament, Welsh Home Rule.
Yes, well, for so long we've been behind in Wales. We've settled for third-rate devolution, and there's absolutely no reason why Wales shouldn't have the going rate for devolution as other parts of the UK are having too. But there's also the question of finance. In Scotland, there is, if we were to be funded the same per head in relation to England as they get in Scotland, there would be an additional £1.2 billion into the Welsh economy, which would make a great difference in terms of cuts and investment into public services, which is much needed in Wales.
Now, in terms of parties of the sort of left, if I can put it that way, there's the Greens, there's the SNP and there's yourselves. Are you going to be working as a kind of bloc in the next Parliament?
We've already said that we are going to cooperate after the next election. We're working together on common areas where we can now. It's not an electoral pact, but it is. It does make sense for us to work together to end the Conservative government and also end the austerity politics, the ideologically driven austerity politics, which is causing so much damage for so many of our communities.
And what for you is the end point? Because I remember in the old days of Daffodillis Thomas and so forth, there's a lot of talk about Plaid not really being a nationalist party, being a post-nationalist party and not wanting full independence. Is that still the case?
We want Wales to become an independent country, there's no doubt about that, but there are many things that we have to do in order to get to that point. Our economy is way behind. We have to make sure that we close the financial gap that exists between Wales and other parts of the UK, but we can get there. And to be honest, the only way that we will get a strong economy is through becoming an independent nation.
Earlier on in the programme, I mentioned Trident. Now, we have heard suggestions from the First Minister in Wales that if the Scots kicked the Trident submarines out, they might arrive in Wales. How would you feel about that?
Well, the First Minister of Wales made that statement in a fit of pique during the Scottish referendum. There's no appetite for Trident to be placed in Wales. In fact, I think most people that I speak to want to see Trident replacement ended. There's a potential £100 billion that could be spent on people as opposed to weapons of mass destruction, and Plaid Cymru will be advocating that case ahead of this election.
Well, that's fairly clear. Now, on the final big subject that confronting you as a party, you are not just not doing terribly well. You've got 3 MPs at the moment, and the polls show that that UKIP, of all parties, is way ahead of you in Wales. What has it been about Wales that has, or Plaid Cymru, which has failed to attract more people in Wales? Because, you know, the comparison with Scotland is obvious and rather embarrassing, I'd have thought.
Well, in terms of, if you just look at the question of media coverage, the parties of the right that you've just talked about get a lot of media coverage. The Scottish parties have had a lot of coverage in Scotland. They've got more of an independent media there. In Wales, we don't have an independent media, and we struggle to get coverage on a UK level. So this is a great opportunity now this morning
on an
to speak to
all-UK
people.
sofa. Leanne Wood, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, last week we heard a lot about the Conservatives' plans for education, tough new tests for literacy and numeracy, but flat cash in terms of funding for English schools. The amount spent on each pupil won't be cut, but it won't be protected from inflation. Now, we'll hear Labour's position on that in just a moment, but first, its announcement today about Sure Start. The Shadow Education Secretary, Tristram Hunt, is here to explain. Good morning to Tristram.
Good morning, Andrew.
So, Sure Start, you want to... it was a Labour policy to help kids, particularly in disadvantaged areas, before school, to get the start they need and deserve. It's been cut by this government, and you are going to expand it again. Yes?
Well, the Sure Start Children's Centres programme was one of the great achievements of the last Labour government. This was about tackling inequality and disadvantage in the early years to make sure that those young kids from poor communities were able to enter reception and year one school ready. It was about celebrating and developing attachment and parenting and good behaviours amongst kids so that they could succeed, because we know that by the age of 7, most of the disadvantage between poor kids and rich kids, which will come out, is already in place. So what we're announcing today is 50,000 new childcare places in our Sure Start children's centres by making sure we're using those existing Sure Start centres to be opened up to charitable, local, private sector childcare providers, and really bringing public sector and private sector together, because we've got a lot of mothballed facilities. We've got these great Sure Start children's centres in our communities not being used effectively, and we want to open them up to the public because we've got rising demand out there. We've got these mothballed facilities in our communities.
So they need to
Let's
be
bring them
opened
together.
up, heated, cleaned, staffed. The kids need to be properly treated once they're there. How much is all this going to cost?
Well, this is a
It can't
zero.
cost nothing.
No, because what we're doing is opening this up for those involved in charitable, in local, in private sector childcare
this is a
facilities.
Labour policy that's entirely going to be driven by charitable people.
They provide the resources, they provide the staff. What we've got are these public sector facilities which are sitting there not being used, and so we're saying that childcare centres will have a statutory duty to go out to Bernardo's, to go out to 4Children, to go out to childcare providers and say, we've got these facilities, we know you've got rising demand, come and use them. It seems to me crazy that if we've got these great facilities in our communities...
This is a Labour policy, but entirely to be delivered by people who are not paid for by government. It's an entirely charitable setup.
Well, this is
all you do is open the doors.
Well, this is public service reform. This is using public sector facilities alongside charitable, alongside private. You know, we're going to be entering government in really tough times, and I, as an incoming education secretary, have to get value for money. And if we've got public sector facilities not being used effectively, I want to make sure they are being used, because this is about poor kids in disadvantaged communities getting the best start in life, and that's always been a Labour priority.
So, beyond that, you also want what you call wraparound childcare for all children in school from 8 in the morning to 6 p.m. Now, that must cost money. Where does that money come from?
This is a really important idea, because I think
we all understand why it's a good idea.
Yeah, but let's understand why, because a lot of children in disadvantaged communities don't get the after-school clubs, the drama, the sport. They don't get the breakfast clubs, the great nutrition in the morning. And again, we're saying we've got these schools in our communities not being used before school and after school effectively. Let's open them up to breakfast school, to breakfast providers, to charities, to children's groups, and let's use public and private together so that we get the drama in poor communities.
I'm not saying it's a bad idea, it's a great idea. What I'm asking you is where the money comes from.
The money comes from parents paying for some of these facilities, but we in the public sector say, well, let's use these schools we've got to open up for them more appropriately. And this isn't about every single school, it's about every child having access to this. So it's schools working together. At the moment, we have schools operating as islands, not collaborating and cooperating with one another. And we know that just in terms of results and attainment, schools collaborating and working with one another works much more successfully for the child.
But you have to put more money in for that.
No. This is about using the existing facilities. This is what the Tories call shaking
the magic money tree.
No, it's not. It is about getting best value money from our private, best value money from our schools estate. And the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is that we're not going to be going into this election with a 10% real terms cut to the schools' budget.
You're going to be spending more money on schools.
We will protect our schools, as we've always done through the history of the Labour Party, because...
So how much more money are you going to be spending on English schools than the Conservatives?
Well, we'll be announcing that in the next few days. But what I can say this morning is that right through the history of the Labour Party, we've always invested in young people, we've always invested in education, and Ed Miliband will continue to do that, not least because of the productivity challenge our economy faces. If we're going to grow our economy, if we're going to deliver wealth in this country, we've got to have a really successful education and skills system. And you don't deliver that with a 10% cut to schools' budgets.
So that's what the Conservatives are going to do in real terms. What can you say? That you will not have a 10% cut in real... Well, in real terms, you will be funding schools more generously or less generously?
As I said, we'll be sending this out in the next few days. Ed Miliband has said we will do better than David Cameron, and I can say we will not be inflicting a 10% cut to schools' budgets. That's just not what Labour parties do in government.
Going back to the Sure Start announcement, if you are not putting any money in yourself, how can you possibly have a realistic target? Because it depends upon people out there you don't know, you haven't spoken to, meeting targets that have nothing to do with you when it comes to actual money. If you're not putting the money in, you can't promise anything.
Well, the leading children's charity for children has said there are about 1,100 Sure Start children's centres which could be used much more effectively. And they're the eyes and ears on the ground. And they're angry that we're not using these public facilities more effectively. So we've taken a wide consultation on this. We've researched it. We think we can do it. Look, we need to get more for less out of our public sector. And so we make, no apology for saying, well, how can we utilise these most effectively for local, charitable, private sector groups, public and private together, public service reform.
Well, we've talked about the money before. You have had, as a party, an absolutely miserable week with lots and lots of senior business people queuing up to have a go at you. And one of your own people, perhaps put it better than anybody else, he said, the trouble is the mood music has been wrong from Labour. You don't sound like you're a party enthusiastic about profits, enthusiastic about business and about wealth creation. That is true, isn't it? You have got the tone wrong, if nothing else.
Well, I'm enormously enthusiastic about businessmen and women making money, about delivering shareholder return, about making profit, not least because that will help to support the Sure Start children's centres and the schools. It makes ours a vibrant
Do you think your party, therefore, has to say more to win round those business people who are now very, very sceptical about you?
Well, we've heard from some business people. We've got 5 million great businesses working really hard across Great Britain, making money, as I say, and Labour's on their side. To go back to this earlier point, what is the problem our economy faces? It's a productivity challenge, and that means the state has to play its role alongside business. What is the challenge for our businesses as well? It's markets, and only the Labour Party is committed to ensuring that we've got a successful UK working in Europe, delivering those markets for modern British business. So we are a furiously, passionately, aggressively pro-business party.
Wow, OK, that's clear enough. Let me take you to nuns then. You had a big argument on Question Time with Christina O'Doney about nuns and really about whether all teachers should go through teacher training college first. I suspect that the real fear of a lot of people in Christian communities and, as it were, on the right, is that teacher training colleges are the place where secular, liberal, left-wing ideologies are most promulgated and are then pushed through the education system onto children. And they have a point about that. Are you completely happy about the atmosphere in teacher training colleges at the moment?
Well, we have a challenge in terms of how we get the best out of our schools system. And no education system can exceed the quality of its teachers. So having a really effective initial teacher training process is really, really important. I don't accept that universities and teacher education institutions are hotbeds of sort of secular Marxism. Actually, I think they're doing a really effective job trying to get passionate young people into the classroom, give them the skills to deliver subject knowledge and stages of learning. So I don't accept this sort of culture war idea.
Do you agree, therefore, that lots of people who haven't been in teacher training colleges but are currently teaching, including nuns, can be very, very good teachers?
I'm hugely in favour of people working in education, but as an incoming let me answer. As an incoming education secretary, what am I concerned with? I'm concerned with all across our state school system having the best qualified people going into it, and then year on year delivering high quality teaching. So what I want to see is, yes, qualified teachers in our classroom, and I think parents will be shocked to know that we see more and more unqualified teachers in our classroom, but then to make sure we've got the continuing professional development with them to get better year on year on year.
Can an unqualified nun be a good teacher?
Well, we're not investigating independent Catholic schools. Look, I said on Friday, if I heard offended nuns in any way, that certainly wasn't my intention. My point was this: that we need a highly effective qualified teacher cohort.
Okay, it's a very straightforward question,
in our
schools.
Can
an unqualified nun be a good teacher?
My point is this, that we want our teachers more and more qualified and effective in the state education system. I'm sure there are brilliant teachers who are nuns, who are doing fantastic jobs, but I, as an incoming education secretary, have to think about the entirety of our schools across the state system.
Tristram Hunt, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now, the ordeal by fire of the captured Jordanian pilot during the week was a horrifying reminder of the so-called Islamic State's utter brutality. Hard to comprehend, but its fundamentalist ideology and desire to create a caliphate in the Middle East is proving attractive to some young people in Britain. It's believed that hundreds have gone to fight for IS, and what they might be capable of when they come back is a terrifying question. I'm joined now by the Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley of the Met, who takes the lead on counter-terrorism policing. Welcome, Mr. Rowley.
Good morning.
Can we start by talking about numbers? Because it's suggested that 600 or so people could have gone out and been radicalised in the IS territory in Syria and Iraq and come back here now. Is that about right?
About half of them have come back. So there are many people who have travelled, but we've got about 600 who are of a high degree of concern to us who've travelled out there. Something that illustrates the difference in the problem today is that nearly half of those people who've travelled out there weren't previously on our terrorism radar.
And does that mean that there are 300 people who have been radicalised, who you're worried about, who were out there, who are now back here?
It's that sort of scale, and we're dealing with them in different ways, many investigations. You'll have seen the sentencing this week at that awful case of the guy Khawaja, who's been photographed with bags of heads and in some really gruesome situations.
Now, this is a big, big challenge for you, because I've been told that to follow one person completely full-time takes about 40 people. So you don't have the resources to follow 300 people. It's a very, very big job. Do you have the resources you need as the Met?
It's about prioritisation. We have been doing a lot of work on our resources recently. We've been making some changes to get more resources into some of our areas we need to strengthen around cyber and around digital. And we're also in conversation with government about how we could grow over the next year.
Boris Johnson has said in terms the Met needs more money for this.
We certainly need more money, and that's what we're discussing with government at the moment.
So you think you've got a good chance of getting an increase in your budgets to cope with this serious problem?
Yeah? That's what the indications are at the moment.
Very good. Now, you were presumably, knowing that you were about to do this job, watching the events unfolding in Paris at the time of the Charlie Hebdo killings. What were you thinking? Were you thinking that we could deal with this kind of thing if it happened in London? We'd do better or do worse, or were you just simply horrified by what happened and the speed with which it unfolded?
I think we're all horrified. We've been preparing for a long time for what you might call a marauding terrorist firearms attack. We saw events some time ago, didn't we, in places like Mumbai and Nairobi. So in terms of our national firearms capability, and is it strong enough, how's it placed, how's it organised, we've arranged that to be able to deal with those sorts of events. And we have some well-tested exercise command and control regimes working across the country on counter-terrorism operations. But you look at an event like Paris and you see, actually, that's not everything in that we anticipated, so we're going to have to make some refinements to our plans to improve.
Introducing you onto the sofa, I mentioned ISIS. Is ISIS and its terrorism threat in the West in some way different from what we've seen in the past, or is it similar?
It's very different. We're making 35% more arrests now than we used to in counter-terrorism. It's nearly one arrest a day. That comes out of the fact that we're not just dealing with a classic terrorist organisation organising plots across the world. We're dealing with a group that's trying to create what you might call a corrupt cult of people, of followers who will act in their name. They're trying to attract misfits, criminals and the vulnerable. And it's those people, not part of a bigger organisation, who may act of their own volition. That's the challenge for us, is to have good sight of them and be able to intervene with them.
I was talking to a very senior political figure just this week who said to me, we, as it were, the political class, are absolutely sure there's going to be a serious attack before the election takes place. Is that the kind of thing that you're hearing as well?
You will never hear me use the word inevitable. It's my job to lead our efforts across the country, from Scotland Yard and units around the country, fighting against terrorism. We're not going to be defeatist about it. We're stepping up our activity. We've foiled more plots in the last 6 months than we foiled in that sort of period of time previously. And we're disrupting people day in and day out. We're using any power available, any criminal power, to keep disrupting them, put them on the back foot.
It was clear from Prince Charles's interview this morning that he is perplexed by why young people are being so attracted to this extremist death cult or ideology. What are your reflections, given that you're on the front line?
That's the dynamic that worries us most of all, is the ability of ISIS to reach into communities. We've been making a lot of appeals to communities over the last year, asking them for increasing amounts of help, and we've seen that. We see more information coming forward. So we need a wider coalition against this threat. But there are things the police can do. For example, we're taking down 1,000 unsavoury postings from the internet every week at the moment to try and make it less easy for people who have a potential to be radicalised.
What do you say to those people who look around and say there's armed police now absolutely everywhere, and bit by bit, without a real debate, we have moved from a situation in this country where we had a largely unarmed police force to an armed police force, and this is wrong?
I don't think that's accurate. They are more visible at the moment. There's a heightened terrorist threat, and I think the public are probably a little surprised if they weren't more visible. In London, we have approaching 32,000 officers. A little over 2,000 of them are armed, and we're using those as wisely as we can do to guard the areas we see as most vulnerable.
Well, I think I'm allowed to use the word terrorist and to say good luck. Mark Rowley, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Now then, one of the big announcements in George Osborne's last budget was the creation of pensioner bonds, special high-interest savings for products for the over 65s. And when the bonds went on sale last month, not surprisingly, there was a stampede to buy them. All savers have been hit by low interest rates, however, so was this another case of helping the age group which just happens to be the most likely to vote come the election? Chancellor, that is the charge against you. And what are you going to do about pensioner bonds? Because, as I said, there was a huge rush. Sites crashed. Lots of people were frustrated. Lots of people couldn't get their hands on them.
Well, first of all, good morning.
Good morning, yes, of course.
Backing savers is part of our long-term plan, and our 65-plus pensioner bond has been the most successful saving product this country has ever seen. Over 600,000 pensioners have benefited from it. And what I can confirm today is we're going to guarantee that it remains on sale for another 3 months, because this government backs savers, supports people who do the right thing, and is fixing what went wrong in our economy.
But what that means is that every other taxpayer is subsidising savings by a group of people who are over 65 and have the cash to go into these schemes. So it does seem to be unfair to a lot of people. It's been called reverse social engineering.
Well, we need to support savers in our economy. It's one of the things that went badly wrong in Britain 10 years ago, and one of the things we're trying to fix in our country. It's why I've also, to help low-income savers, abolished the tax rate that Labour introduced, the 10p tax rate that they introduced on savers. So I'm taking these measures, and look, I think you've got to see this in the context of an economic plan where there have been very low interest rates to support the economy during this difficult period. That has hit savers. I think it's perfectly reasonable for a Chancellor to say, I want to support savers specifically.
I accept
and that's why, as I say, today we're saying this 65-plus pensioner bond, which has been enormously popular and successful, is going to stay on sale for another 3 months.
So in terms of actual hard cash, how much more is going to be available for this?
Well, we set aside £10 billion of government financing for it. That's not what it costs. That's the money we seek to raise through retail investors at home rather than international bond markets. We're saying it's going to be available for the next 3 months. We estimate that there'll be around another £5 billion, but that's just an estimate. What I'm guaranteeing is that it will be available for the next 3 months.
So the cost is the extra interest rate that you are guaranteeing. How much is it going to cost the rest of the taxpayers to do this?
Well, it's a kind of opportunity cost, but it's several £100 million over a period of months, part of a savings policy that fixes what goes wrong in our economy. That's part of our long-term economic plan.
And why should relatively poor working-age voters spend that kind of money to help pensioners who have extra money already to invest?
Well, I've explained, first of all...
because they vote?
No. It's important we back savers in our economy. By the way, many of these pensioners do not have large sums of money. They have relatively small savings. They've had these very low interest rates. That's been a deliberate act of government policy, working with the Bank of England. We've actually had activist monetary policy to keep interest rates low. We've had special programmes to help people buy a home, for example, through Help to Buy. I think it's also important we help people who are hit by those low interest rates, if you like. Those are the savers. And the 65-plus pensioner bond is a demonstration of our commitment, alongside the other action we've taken to support savers, like abolishing the 10p tax rate on savings, like the new freedoms for pensions, which come in place.
There's been a great deal for pensioners. They are the group most likely to vote, and this particular group have the extra. They may not be rich, but they have the extra money by definition to invest. So they are, in a sense, your kind of people that you are helping. And that came up again in a different context in Prime Minister's questions. I want to ask you about the hedge fund managers who are pouring so much money into the Conservative coffers at the moment. Ed Miliband raised this again and again at PMQs. And you gave a special tax cut to hedge funds in the 2013 budget. And a lot of people say the Tories go on and on and on about trade unions backing the Labour Party. Hedge fund managers are backing you in exactly the same quid pro quo way, aren't they?
First of all, no one buys policy in the Conservative Party, unlike the Labour Party, and that is a massive difference. You know, our donations, made from many, many thousands of private individuals across the country, do not buy influence over policy in the same way that the unions buy influence over the Labour Party policy. But let me specifically address this issue of financial services. Financial services is an incredibly important industry for this country. There are hundreds of thousands of people working in places like Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Edinburgh, in this vital industry. So we want a successful financial services industry, but I have been the Chancellor prepared to tackle abuse in this sector.
Your party has taken £47 million from hedge funds over the last few years, and in the 2013 budget, at a time when schools are crying for money, hospitals are crying for money, you chose to give hedge funds a big tax cut. A lot of people think that's a very strange thing to do.
The measure you're referring to actually explicitly didn't apply to hedge funds. What I did do in the budget was apply an additional tax on hedge funds.
I'm talking about the stamp duty.
Well, I tackled the abuse of partnerships in hedge funds. That raised £2 billion. The measure you're referring to that Ed Miliband raised was actually legislated for by a Labour government, extended by Ed Balls when he was the city minister. And this is
then extended by you?
No, we have not extended it. What I just say, Andrew, the hypocrisy here. When I came to office, there were bankers paying lower tax rates than the people who clean for them. Foreigners didn't pay capital gains tax. Rich people didn't pay stamp duty on the homes they bought. We have tackled all of those things. It was David Cameron who put tax avoidance at the top of the G8 agenda. Labour was the tax avoiders' friend. We have tackled that. It was wrong, and we have put it right.
So do you now support what Ed Miliband was saying this week about British dependent territories being put on a blacklist?
Well, first of all, we have insisted these overseas territories automatically exchange tax information with us. But if you want a microcosm of why the Labour leader is unfit to be Prime Minister, you look at his announcement. He says he wants to put on some blacklist countries that don't have a central register. Now, Britain is having a central register because David Cameron and myself wanted Britain to have one.
We're talking about places like the British Virgin
I'll tell you what
Islands
we're talking
and
about.
Guernsey and so
the countries that would be hit by Ed Miliband's policy would be the United States of America, France, Germany. So the new British Prime Minister would turn up in Washington and say, I'm blacklisting your country. He'd then go to Brussels.
I think what he was saying is that British dependent territories should be blacklisted if they are tax havens.
I think he makes it up as he goes along. And if you actually look at what he's saying he wants to blacklist almost every country of the OECD because they don't have these central registers. Britain is leading by example. It is having these central registers. It is insisting that its overseas territories transparently share information with us. But the Labour leader is simply not fit for office because he does not think through the consequences of his anti-business, anti-enterprise and anti-our partners abroad policies.
So if you are so tough on the hedge fund managers, why do you think it is that more than half of your leading donors are hedge fund managers?
We receive donations from across the country. We're getting at the moment over 4,000 donations a month through our internet site from people across the country. My own local party has got almost 100 new members in the last few months alone. So we get support from a wide range of people, but support from business, by the way, shows that we have an economic policy that works. One thing we have learned...
Let's move, if we may, straight on to the economic policy.
Yeah.
Whether it's, the IFS, in its green budget this week, suggested that there needed to be more than £50 billion of cuts to departmental budgets if you were going to meet your targets during the next Parliament. Is that a number you recognise?
Well, we believe there is a £30 billion additional consolidation.
Why not the £50 billion?
Well, partly because we've already set out £13 billion of savings required in the coming financial year. They're identified, legislated for and going to take place. There's a £30 billion required on top of that. And we've said you need to get £13 billion from government departments. You need £12 billion of savings in our welfare budget, so we have a welfare system our country can afford. And we need a further £5 billion of measures to tackle tax avoidance and tax evasion and all that, so that we make sure that the rich continue to pay. So
what is the figure that you end up having to squeeze out of departmental budgets?
Well, as I say, the additional savings required are the £13 billion of savings.
Only 13, not 15,
well,
not 30.
as I say, our package requires £30 billion of consolidation.
Yes.
And of that, 13 billion needs to come from the government departments. By the way, we've shown in this Parliament that you can achieve that. What I'm saying is not we need to go faster, nor that we need to go slower. We need to go on working through our long-term plan, because in a very uncertain world, with a lot of instability and risk abroad, we need stability and certainty at home.
You have to take a lot of money out of non-protected departments, and we were talking earlier on in the programme about defence in particular. Can you say that defence will be ring-fenced? Because if you can't, a lot of people in the defence sector think that we are, as General Sir Richard Sheriff put it, waving a tiny little stick around in the world. We are losing a huge amount of influence, and we are not the country we ought to be or should used to be.
Well, first of all, I don't accept that. I think Britain is hugely influential in the world. We are a huge contribution to the operation against ISIL in Iraq.
Well, look at
the contribution we're making to tackle Ebola in West Africa. Look at the huge humanitarian effort we're providing to deal with the crisis in Syria. You know, our influence is felt.
Three military people in Iraq outside the Kurdish area.
Well,
the Australians have got hundreds. You know, other countries are pouring in money. We did 7% of the attacks on ISIL from the air have been British. That is not the kind of contribution that a lot of people thought that we would be making.
Well, first of all, we, after the Americans, are the second largest contributor to the airstrikes. We've also got 500 people supporting that operation. But are you saying we don't have hundreds of British soldiers on the ground in Iraq? The answer is no, we don't, because actually we've learnt our lesson, this government, and we're not going to repeat the mistakes of our predecessors.
All right, but you can't say that we're going to ring-fence the defence budget if the Conservatives win a majority in the next Parliament.
No, Andrew, what I'd say is this. First of all, you cannot have strong national defence without a strong national economy. The two go hand in hand.
But one has to pay for the other.
Well, we have taken very difficult decisions to fix the defence budget, to sort out the black hole that existed in that budget, to fund the latest generation of aircraft carriers, of strike aircraft, of hunter-killer submarines, to make sure our soldiers have the best equipment. We've actually made a commitment over the coming years that that defence budget for equipment should go up in real terms. We have made that commitment.
And are we going to hit our 2% NATO
target over the next few years? We are currently hitting that target.
We are currently, but I'm talking about the next Parliament.
Well, I'm not going to prejudge our defence review, but people know that we care about our nation's security and defence because we've invested in the latest equipment. People know we have met the 2% commitment and are meeting it today.
What about social care for people at home? Because the NHS crisis, so-called, is really a social care crisis. Huge numbers of people who need to be kept, who could have been kept at home in their homes, being looked after by carers and so forth, end up in A&E, end up in hospitals, block the hospitals. And part of the reason for that is the huge crunch on the budgets of local councils to provide care. That's going to get worse, is it not, with another 5 years of your government?
No, we are bringing together the health and the social care system in a way that was never previously achieved.
But cutting the budgets.
But we're achieving this better care. Look, I'll make a broader point. You cannot have a great national health service. You can't have care for the elderly. You can't have strong national defence if you don't have a secure national economy. If you're not fixing the country's economic problems, you are exposing yourself to a whole load of social problems in our country. The two go hand in hand. They are not either or.
As long as you carry on funding these things, which is my point. Well, we have to. And looking at your plans going ahead, it seems to me, a lot of people, that the Department for Communities, for instance, must be an absolute target for deep cuts next time round because everything else is protected, and that is where social care comes from, and that is going to be a real problem for a lot of people watching this programme, including pensioners.
No, we've actually put more money into a better care fund which brings together social care and the National Health Service. We have a really smart plan now for the NHS, produced by the NHS itself, which we support, the so-called Simon Stevens plan. That's all about trying to get care into our community, take the health service into the local communities to make sure that you aren't getting these two systems, the social care system and the National Health Service, rubbing up against each other. That's smart reform, getting value for money, so that we can go on having brilliant health care.
This to happen. Local authorities will be properly funded to allow this to happen.
Well, local authorities, like other parts of our government, of course have had to take difficult decisions, but the alternative is you can't support your public services because your economy fails, people become unemployed. I mean, look, one thing we've learnt over the last couple of weeks from our opponents, and there is a choice at this general election, is not only did they not have a plan for the deficit, we knew they didn't have that, They don't have a plan to grow the economy because they're attacking the very businesses that create the jobs,
Well,
that pay the
we'll come
revenues
on.
to support the National Health Service, to support social care, to support our defence. You can't separate the economy from the other issues in our country. I don't spend too much time talking about the Labour Party because they get their chance to be had a go at. But I do want to talk about one other economy which is in deep, deep trouble, which is Greece. You met the new Greek finance minister in his splendid leather coat and open neck shirt and all the rest of it. A, what did you make of him, and what's your message to the Greeks and the Germans in their head-to-head confrontation? Well, the Greek finance minister is clearly an intelligent man who cares passionately about his country. But the truth is that this standoff between Greece and the Eurozone is increasing the risks every day to the British economy. That's why I'm going tomorrow to the G20 to encourage our partners to resolve this crisis. It's why we're stepping up the contingency planning here at home. We've got to make sure we don't, at this critical time when Britain also is facing a critical choice, add to the instability abroad with instability at home.
Do you think the best outcome would be for Greece to leave the Eurozone?
I think Greece... I mean, obviously, it's a decision for the Greek people, but Greece has chosen to stay in the Eurozone and has worked hard to stay in the Eurozone. And frankly, a Greek exit from the Eurozone, in my view, would have very serious consequences, not just for the people of Greece,
but it would derail our recovery?
I think if Greece left the euro, that would create real instability in financial markets in Europe. I don't think, although we're in a much better place than we were a couple of years ago in terms of Europe's exposure to Greek banks and the like. I think, frankly, a Greek exit would cause real ructions. That's why we've got to avoid this crisis getting out of control. It's why we've got to make sure that, as I say, we have an international effort to resolve the standoff, that here in Britain we step up our contingency planning to prepare for whatever is thrown at us. And above all, we go on working through our own long-term plan so we are better insulated from these risks. And again, that is all at risk itself in this general election in just 3 months' time.
You're clearly enjoying the job as Chancellor. It's been said that you'd like to stay on partly so that you could negotiate with the European Union ahead of a referendum if you win the next election. Do you think we could see that referendum in 2016 rather than in 2017 as has been talked about?
Well, actually, David Cameron was on this programme at the beginning of this year and said we'd be delighted if we could conclude those negotiations sooner, but we've set the end of 2017 as the deadline. The essential issue here, and again, it's something at stake in this general election, is do we want to change our relationship with Europe? Do we want Europe, including a Britain that is job creating, that is opportunity creating? Do we want to make sure that non-Euro members like Britain have a fair relationship with the Eurozone? And do we want to make sure that Britain has a choice, the British people have a choice in a referendum? And you only get that from David Cameron and from the Conservatives in this election.
And just briefly, however, presumably having an earlier election would lessen the period of instability and uncertainty ahead of that referendum, which, as Chancellor, would be a good thing.
Well, I don't accept that offering a referendum has increased instability because we've received a huge amount of investment from around the world since we set out our policy. Actually, business and investors are the first people who say we want a more competitive European Union and a more competitive Britain within that European Union.
Chancellor, thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and over to Naga for the news headlines.
Andrew, thank you. The Shadow Education Secretary has laid out plans to expand Sure Start centres to help children in deprived areas if the Labour Party wins the election in May. Speaking earlier on this programme, Tristram Hunt said that the Labour government would double the number of childcare places in English Sure Start centres to 118,000 by inviting charities and local providers to use the existing sites. The government is extending the pensioner bond scheme, which gives savers over the age of 65 generous interest rates. Speaking on this programme, the Chancellor, George Osborne, said the scheme had been enormously successful and popular, and the bonds would remain on sale for a further 3 months. That's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. We'll get back to Andrew in a moment. Here's a look at what's coming up immediately after this programme.
Join us live from Southampton at 10, when we'll be asking, does counter-terrorism have a place in schools? Should voting be compulsory? And have beings from other planets guided Earth's religions? See you at 10 on BBC One.
And from us, that's it for this week. Thanks to all my guests. Next Sunday, I'll be talking to the Work and Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan Smith, and one of the most influential musicians of the 60s, and for decades afterwards, the great Ray Davies, formerly of the Kinks, a true great. So do join me for that, but for now, a very good morning and goodbye.